Conversations That Matter is a partner program of the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Welcome. I'm very excited to have you on the show. And I really enjoyed reading your new book, Atmosphere of Hope. And I think the reason that I was so drawn to it is that you talk about saying we have to keep our eye on the ball, but we're doing so many things that say collectively we want to have a better world, and we're working towards some of those solutions. How long did it take you to get to that point where you said, okay, there is hope?
It was a long journey. I was pretty deeply involved with the Copenhagen climate meeting, and I must say I left that more filled with despair than with hope.
Why?
And,
what was it about that? Because I know people say, oh, it was a failure, but I get the sense that there were many positives that came out of Copenhagen.
Look, there were a lot of positives, but I think a lot of us had unrealistic expectations of what might transpire. I mean, it was the biggest meeting of world leaders ever. We had leaders of business there, and as part of the Copenhagen Climate Council, we were responsible for the business leaders. And there was huge expectation and optimism, but it fell apart for whatever reason. What did come out of it was the Copenhagen Accord that President Obama presented to the heads of about half a dozen other states, and that really is the foundation stone for the Paris meeting. It's a bottom-up approach where people say, well, what can we do in light of our economy and the realities that we face? What can we do in terms of emissions reductions? And then add that all together to see where it takes us as a world. So it's not perfect, but it's a good basis for negotiation.
So we come out of Copenhagen and you're kind of like, oh, okay, this didn't get to where I had hoped that it was going to get to. Where did that wind up taking you on? What was the journey that you took from there to where you are now?
Yeah, well, you see, I was aware that year after year after year, we were emitting greenhouse gases at the worst case scenario imaginable, so the fastest rate anyone could have projected. And that takes you further and further into this dangerous territory of climate change. So for a few years I was despairing and really wondering about the nature of the future I was leaving my children. And it was only a couple of years ago that I started to realise that there was an extra tool in the toolkit that we hadn't factored into this. And that was going to be quite important to our future. And I had to invent a name for this extra tool. I called it the third way. And really the third way is about technologies and methods and approaches that allow us to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a scale that makes a difference to the climate and in a way that strengthens the Earth's system or ability to self-regulate. And that concept is a really, really important one.
Well, in a couple of weeks from now, we have Adrian Corliss from Carbon Engineering on talking about that very thing that they're doing just up the road here in Squamish. And it was extraordinary to me to see that you mentioned them in your book.
Well, they're one of the leaders. It's extraordinary that there are those initiatives going on, and yet we haven't seen the concept as a whole yet. We haven't seen it goes all the way from carbon engineering and the making of diesel substitutes through to the making of carbon negative concretes, through to seaweed farming, through to manufacture of carbon nanofibers and conventional plastics. I mean, the world is really opening up in this space, and I think it's a huge area of interest for industry and government.
So you are speaking with optimism.
Yeah,
what was the turning point? Because you say you dipped down after Copenhagen. I see where you are at now, but I'm wondering, what was it that made you go, okay, not all is lost? And the reason that I think that this is important, because I will interact with people who will go, forget it, we're done. I think, no, we can't take that kind of perspective. Otherwise, we won't address the issues that will get us to the world that we want to live in.
Yeah, well, you're right. And look, my optimism has only built since I made that realisation. The first thing I did was, once I understood this, I sat down and did a bit of a scoping study. I'm a judge on the Virgin Earth Challenge Prize, which has provided a lot of the material for me to do that. And the question I had in my mind is, do these technologies really exist? Do any of them have the potential to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere at the gigaton scale? Are they going to be cheap enough to deploy? Are they across a broad enough base that we can cumulatively have a big impact with them? And the answer to all of those questions turned out to be yes. So that was a great thing. Still in the back of my mind was this sense that we were on the worst case scenario trajectory, right? So the job just gets bigger and bigger every year. But then in 2015, this year in April, the International Energy Agency produced a report saying that growth in carbon emissions had stalled in 2014. And that was huge news, you know. The global economy kept growing, but the problem, the emissions had stalled. And that was happening many years earlier than I imagined it ever might. So that was a second cause for optimism. And I guess since I've published the book and been out speaking with people, a third cause for optimism has emerged, which is that wherever I go now, people understand climate change through lived experience. They know what the change in climate means to them, and there is a determination that they want to limit the damage.
People are saying, okay, I don't want to have a discussion about, okay, you know, it's going towards disaster. It's now starting to become more of, okay, well, what can we do to be better? How can we treat Mother Earth in a kinder, gentler way? And so, but we need to do that because it can't all just be disruptive technologies that are going to displace the use of particularly coal, and then to a lesser degree oil, and then gas, natural gas, and so on.
That's right. And I think people are discovering that if you do treat Earth in a kinder, gentler way, you get better outcomes in a whole lot of unexpected ways. So one of the big things that's happened in Australia, for example, is in inner cities, cycling has really taken off. And fitness levels are naturally increasing as a result of that. People are not as overweight as they were before. They're getting exercise. It's better. It's better all around. And so, and the same with food, I think. You know, if you kind of look at what you eat and make sure you're eating stuff that's produced sustainably, you tend to eat more sensibly, I think. So there are a whole lot of pluses to it. And people do, the younger generation particularly, understand that this is all we've got. This one planet is what we've got. If you enjoy the amenity of forests and clean air and clean water and beaches and wholesome food, you have to take some responsibility for that in the way you live.
I got to ask you to hang on for just 1 second. We have to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program. Thank you. So we take that on, but we also have to, we really do have to focus on what innovation can bring us. Because I look at the world ahead of us and go, okay, there's let's say half the world's population, a little more, that have benefited quite nicely from the use of harnessed energy, whether it's coal, oil, or whatever. It is what drives progress. There's still, you know, close to half of the world's population that's just starting to get to that point where they're going to enter the consumer class. And when they do, they're going to want the same stuff. And so the demand on energy is going to go up.
That's absolutely right. And look, I deal with this frequently in my role as an advisor to the Tata Power Group, which are the biggest single privately owned energy provider in India. And that's exactly the problem they face, that India is in perpetual energy drought. They need to develop new cost-effective sources of electricity for their country at scale, at a very large scale. And of course the debate is always, you know, do we build a new coal-fired power plant? Do we build a gas plant? Do we build more hydro? Land issues in India are part of that because, you know, there's multiple uses is everywhere. And I must say that for years I felt that we were making, if any progress, then slow progress. But that has changed in the last 12 months to 24 months in India. With the election of the Modi government, there's a much more can-do attitude around a lot of this stuff. And that's been reflected in the way companies are engaging with energy. The drop in price of solar and wind has also had a big impact. And I think now for the first time I get the sense that India is going to avoid that carbon-intensive development pathway that has characterised the developed world and China.
They'll just leapfrog over.
That's right, yeah. And if India can do that, then the rest of the developing world, Africa and South Asia, is going to follow India's example.
Let's talk about some of the technologies that have you the most excited. You know, you talked a little bit about geoengineering. That one, I have to say, scares me a little bit.
It scares me. Look, when I wrote The Weathermakers 10 years ago, I had to, you know, it was one of the few options we had to deal with a destabilising climate. Looking back on that now, I think that was a mistake. I think geoengineering in terms of sulphur in the stratosphere or iron filings in the ocean to fertilise the ocean are hazardous. They're very, very dangerous things to be doing. The temptation is that they're cheap and they're instant in terms of the effect they have, right?
Right.
So a country suffering badly from climate change will be tempted to use them to stabilise things, but it'll be a band-aid solution which will have bad consequences at all.
And we have no idea what the long-term consequences could be.
Well, there's been some modelling on that. Some scientific modelling suggested that the long-term consequences will be severe. And the trouble is, if you need to cool the planet quick in order to save your country from descending into chaos, the temptation will be there to use it. But the true solution is in this longer development pathway, I think, for the third way technologies. And that's the pathway we have to follow. It's a more difficult pathway that doesn't have the short-term kind of benefits, the instant benefits, but in the longer term, it's the only sustainable way forward.
So that's sulfur, but one of the other suggestions is to put water vapor into the upper stratosphere. What would be the benefit of that? Because doesn't water vapor already make up a considerable amount of greenhouse gases?
Yeah, it does, but it also, up in the stratosphere, it turned to ice, and ice can be quite reflective, so you can again reflect some sunlight back. But all of these geoengineering proposals have one thing in common: they don't deal with the problem.
So then what is a technology that makes you say, okay, this is not going to be a stopgap or a quick fix? Yeah. It can actually bring along potential positive long-term results that will start to alter the equation that is adding up to not a pretty picture.
Sure. Well, let's look at one, and I pulled it out at random pretty much. But seaweed farming is an interesting one. You know,
that one caught me by surprise.
Yeah, there's been a desktop study which shows that if you cover 9% of the world's ocean with seaweed farms, you would be drawing down all of the emissions we're currently putting up in the air in any 1 year. You know,
just 9%.
Yeah,
would
9%
draw in
of the
all of the emissions from 1 year.
Yeah, that's right. So, and every year it'd do that. So you'd be having a zero-sum gain, right, for emissions if you could do that. Now, 9% of the world's ocean turns out to be a big area. It's about 4 times the size of the contiguous 48 US states.
4 times the size.
Yeah, so it's a big area, right?
Yeah.
But it offers enormous side benefits as well, because the growing seaweed, and seaweed grows 30 to 60 times faster than land-based plants, you know. Because that growing seaweed buffers the ocean's acidity levels, it reduces acidification. Seaweed farms are a perfect location to do fish farming. And those desktop studies suggest that, you know, not only would you be drawing down all the emissions we put up in any 1 year with 9% of the ocean covered in seaweed farms, but you'd grow enough protein to provide 200 kilograms of fish or prawns or shellfish, whatever you want, for every one of the 10 billion people that'll be existing on Earth by 2050. So we need to look at these options. You know.
So what happens to that carbon when the seaweed consumes it?
Well, that's a great question, right? So you've got big piles of rotting seaweed, which could be a problem.
Because seaweed only has a life that's so long, and so you're generating new seaweed plants. Yeah,
that's right. One of the proposals is that we put that seaweed into what are called biodigesters or methane digesters, and they exist on farms here in Canada and Australia and wherever else. You can put waste into them basically. The waste breaks down to methane. You can then burn the methane for electricity, which is useful. But then you've got to get the CO2 and put it somewhere. And one of the possibilities that exists, again, only at desktop level, right? But one of the possibilities that exists, as you could take that CO2 and bury it in shallow oceanic sediments under about 2 to 3 kilometres depth of water. Because in those depths, the overlying column of water pressurises the CO2 and keeps it stable down there, and eventually it turns into a solid form of CO2 and is just incorporated into the sediments. And you know, ultimately, the ocean sediments is where all the excess CO2 is going to end up anyway, because that's the way the Earth system works. It just lays it down as carbonate. But that's going to take centuries or millennia, whereas we could put it down there much quicker, which would be a big potential part of the solution if these technologies work out.
I wish that we could just push right through, but unfortunately we've got to take a second break here. We'll be right back. Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program. Thank you. So where are we at then as far as starting to increase the production of seaweed as a carbon eater?
Well, there are some big seaweed farms that we can use as kind of R&D experiments. There's about 500 square kilometres of seaweed farms off China for edible seaweed. But this is really a desktop study, all of this stuff. Right? It hasn't even got out of the computer yet.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying to people is, if we want to have the benefit of even 1% of the world's oceans, used as seaweed farms, we've got to start now. We have to start developing the R&D now. It may turn out that for one or other technical reason, seaweed farming is not feasible at scale. But there are plenty of other options. And the trouble is, if we want to be using them in 2050, we've got to start the development now. It's like wind and solar has shown us that. These technologies take decades to come to maturity.
Yeah, because I start to think about seaweed and I go, okay, but where's the economic model that supports seaweed farming on that scale?
Yeah.
What do you do with it? Does it then have to become a government-supported program?
I mean, that's a very valid question, and I don't think we're going to know the answer to that till we've got some trial plants up and running, because we don't know where the value stream is going to be. It may be parts of that seaweed can be used for other products or other things. Again, we haven't really ventured into that. The sequestration would probably need a carbon price in order to make sure that happens. But you can imagine seaweed farming is producing protein in the way of prawns and seafood and so forth, as well as a large amount of biomass that could be used for energy or some other product to be cost effective, even if you're paying the cost of sequestration. So, but as I said, at the moment, this is desktop stuff, and it's going to be years, if not decades, before we can ground-proof any of this stuff.
But what isn't desktop any longer is carbon engineering. They're running a test plant up in Squamish.
That's incredible. I read the figures. There's something like 1 million litres a year or something they're planning to produce of fuel.
Well, and that's just where they're at right now.
Yeah.
And, and they're pulling carbon out of the air.
Yeah, see, that's incredible. What a fantastic thing. And a decade ago, that wasn't even on the drawing board, So, but could I just say, that's fantastic that it's gone from nothing to where it is now. But even if it's 1 million tonnes a year of product, that's still a long way from a gigaton, Scaling up is the issue, and that's why these things take decades to reach.
And this is exactly what Adrian said. Okay, well, we're a small company, we're a Canadian organization, we can do it, but really it has to be others take it on and they do it in other jurisdictions, because there's no way that one organization can do this on its own.
That's right, and it will take time. It's a bit like, carbon engineering is probably a bit like wind power in Denmark in the 70s or 80s, They had worked out the technology to do it, they had it in place, had some government support, so that was all great. But it was a long way from being a world-beating technology, which hopefully carbon engineering will turn into.
Yeah.
But for places like BC and Canada, isn't that such a logical element of your future? You've been mining these tar sands for years. We've now got to the end of that sort of stuff. Here's a technology that lets you take the problem and turn it into a solution, a usable product.
Well, and what he pointed out was, we're taking carbon out of the air, we're turning it back into a fuel, so it's not that we're just taking it out, we're preventing other stuff from coming out of the ground because we're replacing it with something that is already there.
That's right. And that fuel, I don't know the chemical pathways he's using, but I suspect that in time you'll be able to take those things and use them to produce other products from the petrochemical industry, such as plastics and fertilisers, some of which stick around for a long time and sequester the carbon for a long time. So let's hope that those pathways are profitable for BC.
Final break, promise? We'll be right back. Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program. Thank you. So is there any other technology that has you as excited?
There are a couple of other approaches that have me excited. One of them is, again, speculative. I guess all of the exciting ones are speculative, but there's this idea that we could be sequestering carbon dioxide snow in Antarctica. Now, I don't know whether you've heard about this as an idea, but some astronomers looked up at Mars and said, well, that planet's got ice caps made of carbon dioxide. Why doesn't the Earth? And it turns out that over Antarctica, the conditions just aren't quite cold enough for CO2 to fall out of the atmosphere as snow regularly. The average,
in Antarctica, it's not quite cold enough.
Yeah, average temperatures across Antarctica are about minus 57 degrees. Right? The freezing point of CO2 is minus 78.5. but it occasionally gets down to -90 over Antarctica. So it really does snow CO2 over Antarctica, you know, when conditions are right. But the stuff doesn't get buried, and then when temperatures warm, it just sublimates back into the atmosphere. But these guys said, well, why don't we think about some chiller boxes in Antarctica, where you could, you know, scrape off a layer of snow, cool the air, and have CO2 fall out as snow. And they reckon they can get a snowfall of 40 centimetres a day, you know, thickness, just chilling the air, you know, a couple of tens of degrees.
And what about solar? There is incredible advances that are happening in photovoltaic solar panel development.
Look, I think we're seeing just the beginning of a big solar boom. People think that it's a mature technology, but it's not. I mean, I'm working with a company in Italy at the moment who are looking at using sand as a storage mechanism for solar power, which is very, very simple. So we're seeing a whole lot of innovation from the sort of basic end through to the high-tech end in this space. I think it's going to really change things.
So when you start to see people like Bill Gates now start to put as much energy as he is into addressing climate through science,
Yeah.
does that buoy your spirits? Do you come away going into Paris now thinking, okay, I've got a realistic perspective, but the world is now starting to get behind us?
I think so. It is. And look, I don't want people to think that my optimism about this is based on the idea that it's going to be an easy job, right? It's not going to be an easy job.
Just to wrap up, I get the sense that you're at this point in your journey where you're saying, I have faith in us collectively that we will endeavor to find solutions and that we will endeavor to change our behavior. Am I right about that? Is that where you're at?
You are totally right about that. You are totally right. I think that maybe the question for me is, you know, can I help focus the world a bit on the right solutions? Because we don't have any time to waste. We need to be looking at the right approach.
You just said something there, can I? And so you talked about the power of the individual in the book, and I know that you're talking about, you know, the work that you're doing and so on, but so many of us turn to governments or corporations. What role do we as individuals play?
Well, governments and corporations are made up of us.
Right.
We can all do something, and I think that the single what cheers me the most as I travel around is meeting all of these people who have shown leadership in the climate area, even if it's in their local community or their local workplace. I mean, it's so powerful, that sort of stuff. That's why we're getting political change. It's why we're getting industry to change. It's about people, and that stuff doesn't really come top down. I know that political leadership and so forth is important, but it has to be reflected by community groundswell. And it's all of those individual people that actually make the difference in the longer term. So asking yourself, what can I do, is incredibly important, I think.
Well, I think you've done an amazing amount.
Well,
thank you very much.
you.
I appreciate you for coming in and doing this.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.